So in this video, I'm going to be responding to ContraPoints' gender critical video from the perspective of a radical feminist. For background purposes, I am a gender nonconforming lesbian who used to identify as a non-binary transgender man. For many years, and to the best of my ability, I lived my life as a transgender man. After learning more about radical feminism, I realized that individual transition was not the answer to sex-based dysphoria and desisted. I'm going to be structuring my video the same way ContraPoints has so that I can respond to all the arguments presented in the original video. I will also be posing many of the same questions I asked myself in order to understand gender better, in hopes that you, viewer, can come to understand why I came to these conclusions as a trans-identified individual.
So look, it's 2019 and I think most people have heard about TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists. TERFs don't like being called TERFs. They think it's a term of disparagement, which it is. They call themselves radical feminists, radfems, or lately, gender critical. The idea is that gender, femininity, masculinity, gender roles, all that, it's all a patriarchal construct, and biological sex is the only thing that makes a person a man or a woman.
Radical feminists are seen as trans-exclusionary because we believe that biological sex is immutable and that gender is entirely socially constructed, which means the only thing that can make someone a woman is that she is born into the female sex. Because ideas of gender necessarily vary from culture to culture, it is then fair to infer that all concepts of femininity and masculinity are entirely socially constructed and, inevitably, influenced by patriarchy. Therefore, we reject conservative and trans ideologies which take it for granted that gender is innate and that part of being a woman is about the expression of an inner feminine essence. Because gender is the way sex-based oppression manifests, the project of female liberation must center on the abolition of gender, not on its reform. We also believe that the idea that possessing a certain set of personality traits, interests, or feelings must mean you're not really a man or a woman is inherently sexist and homophobic.
How can you be a woman without the oppression experiences of girlhood? Why can't you just be a feminine man instead of equating womanhood with sexist stereotypes? Why are misogynistic gender ideologues erasing the vocabulary needed to discuss female oppression? Trans people don't like engaging with these questions because most of the time they're just brandished as weapons against us. In this video, I want to take at face value the questions and concerns associated with gender-critical hostility to trans people, and I want to try to give nuanced answers rather than dogmatic ones.
She immediately frames radical feminist concerns as troll questions, so that's an indicator as to the level of nuance we're going to see in this video.
Concern 1. Gender metaphysics. There is no such thing as a man trapped in a woman's body. There are no pink brains and blue brains. Just because you want to be a woman doesn't mean you are one. This whole sacred dogma of gender identity makes no sense. Is there literally such a thing as a male soul trapped in a female body or vice versa? I personally don't believe there is, but
even if ContraPoints disagrees with the idea of a feminine essence within the soul, a lot of trans people actually do, and it's a really bioessentialist and misogynistic idea if you think about it for more than like 1 second. What is femininity? What is womanhood?
As for brains, there is some evidence suggesting a correlation between binary transgender identity and cross-sex brain anatomy.
So this is actually one of the easiest things to disprove.
Brain differences between men and women are statistical averages of things like gray and white matter density, not, as the term female brain implies, distinct anatomical structures like penises and vaginas.
I mean, this is literally why penises and vaginas are used to categorize the sexes and not the internal feelings of individuals. Anyways, a lot of ContraPoints videos involve at least one rant about how passing she is and how she gets correctly gendered all the time by everyone. And that's what the end of Concern 1 turns into, so we can skip that. ContraPoints doesn't really address the concern very well in my opinion, so let's move on to the second one.
Concern 2. Gender stereotypes. What do you mean you live as a woman? You mean you reinforce oppressive gender stereotypes by putting on nails, makeup, and a fake girly voice? My clothes, makeup, voice, none of this makes me a woman.
So in this video, ContraPoints says that she's not a woman because of her sex, because of her presentation, because of her inner feelings. What is a woman then? If we're following this logic, women don't exist, and neither do trans people, and neither do cis people. What are we supposed to make of this? How are we supposed to organize around any of this?
No trans woman thinks that femininity and womanhood are the same. Rather, we're using a cultural language of feminine signifiers to prompt others to see us for what we are.
That is literally an equation of femininity to womanhood, something ContraPoints just said no trans woman ever does. How does no one else see how regressive this really is? How is anyone supposed to guess anything about your inner life based on how you dress? As a gender nonconforming lesbian woman, I never have to present femininely in order to get sexed properly, nor do my gender nonconforming male friends.
Which I am, but also, if one person calls me sir, that's gonna ruin my day.
Guys, I understand that this is an anti-capitalist position, but I think it's okay to be gender nonconforming and to not let the opinions of strangers dictate your happiness. Actual lesbians tend to realize that early on.
I think butch or gender nonconforming cis women sometimes side-eye hyperfeminine trans women because they don't identify with this vision of womanhood at all.
Maybe gender nonconforming women would support you if you didn't explicitly believe that your femininity is what makes you a woman, something you've expressed repeatedly throughout this video and others. Our entire cause is about how being gender nonconforming doesn't make us not women. What do you want us to do here?
I think there should be more gender freedom, less coercion, less restriction.
We need to abolish gender, not reform it. What does less restriction, less coercion even mean here if we're not directly talking about undoing gendered concepts? This makes zero sense. The solution to being trapped inside a box is not to make the box comfier to be trapped in. Femininity and masculinity aren't neutral concepts for people to play around with at their leisure. They're restrictive, oppressive dichotomies that literally oppress people. A lot of feminist and Marxist scholars have, written about this.
I feel like we should be able to form some kind of solidarity here.
ContraPoints in this video repeatedly says that she is a woman because people see her as one. I just don't understand how anyone can expect to find solidarity among butch women when they parrot the exact same misogynistic rhetoric that literally oppresses gender nonconforming women.
Concern 3. Abolish gender. But you should be moving beyond the patriarchal constructs of masculinity and femininity, not conforming to them. Real feminism aims to abolish gender, not reinforce it.
Unironically, yes? ContraPoints just makes fun of this idea for like a minute before going back to the video.
Look, maybe abolishing gender is a good idea. Like, wouldn't it be better if your genitals at birth didn't determine what kind of life you could live?
Yes. This is what radical feminists have been saying for decades, actually.
But that is a utopian project requiring massive systemic change.
Okay, so is the point here that the work shouldn't be done then? Because the exact same thing could be said about building an anti-capitalist society. Does that mean that we shouldn't take steps towards building an anti-capitalist society? That we should all just be consumers because that's the world we live in? No, obviously not. If something is harmful to people, obviously we should abolish it. Abolitionism has historical precedents. We're not exactly trying to reinvent the wheel here. In a society without gender, in a society where anyone, regardless of sex, could look any way they want, dress any way they want, behave any way they want, aspire to be anyone and anything they could imagine. How would you transition into the opposite sex? If no one is expected to perform gender, how will you socially transition into the opposite sex when there are zero expectations as to what men and women should look or behave like?
And denying trans people their gender identity because abolish gender is kind of like denying citizenship to immigrants because abolish borders.
So this is one of the things that trans activists like ContraPoints tend to do a lot. They love to paint radical feminists as having like a crazy amount of systemic power. Here, ContraPoints positions radical feminists as having power over trans people comparable to the power of a government to immigrants. Let's also note here that ContraPoints is stating that trans feelings are fundamentally more important than the project of female liberation. To all feminists listening, many structures, groups, and individuals have a vested interest in female subjugation, and our liberation is going to hurt other people's feelings. This is none of our concern.
Like, you're targeting the people who are the most vulnerable under the present system, and then leveraging that system against them under the pretense of abolishing it.
I also used to believe that trans women were the most vulnerable people on Earth until I actually started looking for sources. So in 2016, an estimated total of 17,250 people were murdered in the US. Trans people counted for 27 of those deaths. 27 is 0.15% of murders in the US. Per capita, that's a ratio of 1.3 trans people murdered for 100,000. The ratio for women is twice as high at 2.3 per 100,000. The ratio for men is 4 times higher at 8.6 men murdered per 100,000. Trans people have the lowest murder rates of any demographic in the world. Furthermore, here are just a few of the organizations, some federal, that have pledged several hundreds of thousands of dollars to support trans rights: the Human Rights Campaign, Freedom for All Americans, Planned Parenthood, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Arcus Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Gilead Sciences, the Gill Foundation, Open Society Foundations, the Tawani Foundation. In 2017, a tracking report published by the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, FFLI, states that the amount of money given internationally to LGBT issues was $183 million. Gay men received $8.2 million, 6% of all funding. Lesbians received $2.3 million, 2% of all funding. Transgender causes were given $32 million, almost a fifth of all LGBT funding. Does this sound like the most systemically oppressed group of all time to you?
You know, you don't see gender-critical feminists in Kim Kardashian's Instagram comments like, "Why are you wearing a dress, Kim, you creepy misogynist? You should..."
So I legitimately cannot think of a worse example than this, considering the fact that feminists have critiqued specifically all of the Kardashians for being sexist for years now. Also, before anyone even knew what a trans woman was, radical feminists were critiquing the complicity of your quote-unquote cis women, so maybe shut up.
No, they don't attack the gender expression of people with power and influence. They're all on Twitter harassing some poor newly out trans woman with 200 followers and calling her a creepy man and mocking her for being feminine ineptly or being... It's almost like when they say abolish gender, what they really mean is abolish trans people. It's almost like this is a hate movement hiding behind a handful of pseudo-feminist platitudes. But surely, I must be missing something.
Yes, you are missing something, because after the abolition of gender, not only would trans people be quote-unquote abolished, so would, you guessed it, cis people as you know them today.
Concern 4. Male privilege. It is absolutely typical of male privilege and entitlement that you think you can just claim womanhood for yourself without living any of the struggle that entails. So look, I'm a successful, white, middle-class trans woman. In the grand scheme of things, I'm really not very oppressed.
Finally, something honest.
I don't like to complain about every little microaggression I experience because, under the circumstances, if one person calls me sir, it just seems a little good. But I've had cis feminists of my race and class tell me that I have no idea what it's like to be talked over or to experience street harassment or to have to treat every first date like a potentially life-threatening situation, and it's just bizarre to me that they think that.
First of all, if 100% of the people who attack and kill transgender women are men, why is it on women, namely radical feminist lesbians, to change their behavior? Why do trans people focus on women who disagree with them instead of the men actually laying hands on them? No radical feminist disagrees that trans women face violence at the hands of men. We just don't think that means that they're women. Gay men are killed too in violent ways. This does not mean that trans women or gay men can become forcibly impregnated due to rape. There's a difference.
Once you start passing as a woman, it's really a step up, even though women get treated bad.
So you agree that gender-conforming people get treated better than gender-non-conforming people, and we should address that? Well, luckily that's what radical feminists have been doing for decades now. Anyways, would you believe me if I said this also devolves into another rant about how passing she is? Anyways, did you guys know that adhering to beauty standards actually makes you complicit in upholding and perpetuating those standards? Fun fact.
Concern 5. Male socialization. So you had a male upbringing, you never experienced the traumas of girlhood, you benefited from male privilege for decades, and now you think none of that matters? You are who you are because of how you were socialized, not because of how you dress. Trans women often don't experience male socialization the way cis men do. Many trans women are feminine and queer before they transition, and have always experienced a kind of femphobia that is rooted in misogyny.
Consider the fact that this already has a name and it's called homophobia. Consider the fact that all gendered socialization is traumatic, because masculinity and femininity are not inborn concepts that arise naturally out of anyone. Socialization literally happens before birth. Also, female fetuses are literally aborted just for being female fetuses. There's literally a shortage of females in China because of this. I just don't understand why we're all pretending that we can't fucking use Google!
Socialization doesn't end with childhood, it's a lifelong process. Some trans women also identified as women years before transitioning and internalized society's messaging about women more than society's messaging about men.
I don't even know what this is supposed to mean. Every single person internalizes society's messaging about both genders. This reminds me of the comment Grimes made about Sophie, where she said she felt it was really unfair for a male producer to take that name, when it's so hard for female producers to get recognition within the industry. She said this before Sophie came out as a transgender woman, and she is still getting called transphobic for this, as the assumption being that we're not allowed to criticize any man on the case that he just so happens to one day come out as a transgender woman. That's completely absurd.
It's still not the same as living in society as a girl from birth, but it's also pretty different from the socialization of most cis men.
This doesn't negate the fact that you lived almost 30 years of your life as a heterosexual man, regardless of if that was unpleasant for you.
There's that wonderful quotation from Sylvia Plath where she describes the way living as a woman stifles an adventurous spirit and her longing for a male experience.
So here ContraPoints has quoted a woman expressing a desire to be seen as human, and ContraPoints' response to this is that she personally would rather stay inside sucking dick. So maybe this is why, it's a little hard to find solidarity with butch lesbians.
I suspect the reason this is such a major talking point for many gender-critical feminists is that there's an element here of stolen valor, this sense of injustice that people are claiming their identity without experiencing their oppression.
Okay, can we all just take a moment to appreciate what's like the most self-obsessed interpretation of females wanting to organize around their sex-based oppression possible? Stolen valor?
Concern 6. Reproductive oppression. You don't know what it's like to grow up being shamed for your periods, to fear unwanted pregnancy, to have to fight for your right to abortion, to bear the pain of childbirth. But of course, no individual woman experiences all the things women experience, and individual women understand the meaning of womanhood in drastically different ways.
The point of discussing sex-based oppression is that womanhood isn't real. We don't talk about anything as womanly experiences. There's nothing womanly or feminine about pregnancy. We are saying that only women, regardless of what their individual condition may be, belong to the class of people capable of becoming pregnant, because it is necessarily important that we organize around the material realities that oppress us as a class. Engels, wrote very explicitly that the systemic exploitation of the female body and its reproductive capabilities is what created the family, which in turn created private property, the state, so on and so forth. That the exploitation of women antedates and makes possible all other forms of oppression is central to Marxist theory. Were it not for the subjugation of women, private property and the state would not exist. Once again, this is a central component of anti-capitalist theory. It is beyond ahistorical to claim that women are not oppressed for their female biology.
Concern 7. Erasing female vocabulary. Trans activists are erasing the vocabulary needed to discuss women's bodies and women's oppression. We are now expected to talk about pregnant people and menstruators just to appease the gender ideologues. Well, I, for one, am not a menstruator. I am a WOMBYN, and I will not be erased.
Yeah, remind me again how this isn't misogynistic.
Here's the tea. Some medical organizations have recently begun using the term pregnant people instead of pregnant women. And in 2016, Planned Parenthood included the word menstruators in a tweet about the repeal of a tampon tax. This has prompted some conservative TERF and Christian publications to post panicked commentaries warning that the entire concept of womanhood is being erased.
Notice the grouping of radical feminists with the conservative right.
But in fact, medical language that assumes that everyone with a uterus is a woman erases trans men or non-binary people who menstruate and get pregnant. Institutional medical language is designed to be inclusive and therefore impersonal.
Due to discrimination against the female sex, many women are unfamiliar with their anatomy and the vocabulary used to even describe it. ContraPoints' argument is that because 1% of the population is uncomfortable with words necessary to describe reality, medical institutions should completely erase women and hope that every working-class woman being told that cervix owners should be regularly screened for cancer even knows what a cervix is. And yes, I'm specifying women because this does not happen to men.
My prediction is that menstruators is not going to work out. Maybe people who menstruate?
So maybe females, the only people who, regardless of individual condition, are biologically capable of menstruation?
Concern 8. TERF is a slur. TERF is a slur designed to silence women. Nay, it is hate speech designed to incite violence against women. The word TERF is a pejorative for a person who dresses up transphobia with radical feminism, but it's not a slur.
So here is the opinion of an actual expert in social linguistics who disagrees and, in fact, does believe that TERF is a slur.
Anyways, after this, the video kind of devolves into nonsense. ContraPoints compares gender-critical radical feminists, aka women working to end male violence and female oppression, to race realists, aka white supremacists, which kind of immediately weakens the argument that TERF isn't just feminazi 2.0. Then the video ends with a tirade against radfem's transphobia with screen caps of transphobic messages on forums. Once again, let's note here that ContraPoints did not choose to include any screenshots of trans people's misogyny, threatening radical feminists with rape, death, or violence. ContraPoints' video is literally bookended by uncharitable examples of radical feminists as delusionally transphobic conservatives. You know, trans women love to say that radical feminists are getting them killed, but we're kind of the ones being attacked by trans women. So maybe take that into consideration before spreading lies about us.